I don't think anyone owns a painting of themselves. And I wouldn't want a self-portrait in my house either. It's understandable. I can't imagine it happening. Well, with the piece Chronic, it was kind of painted during this period that I consider like a dry spell, where after I finish a show, I just feel totally empty. So I kind of forced myself to go back into the studio and start this piece, which ended up being a little bit darker, kind of just about being in that moment and being a little depressed and not being able to come out of something, and it being this chronic, constant way of dealing with something. We're all setting suns. That piece came during a time right after Chronic, where I felt like I was finally able to go back into the studio and make some new work. It also came after a time period where I did all of the collaboration pieces with David Raymore. My color palette had been changing a lot, and he had been using photographs that had been blurred, and I was kind of painting on top of that. So then I became fascinated with the image being blurred instead of sanded and pushed back. So the only part of the painting where I use black, like a tube black, is in the pupil of the eye, because I find it to be the darkest place, and if the colors are mixed, they tend to go to one other side of the spectrum, but the black is just solid. So when I went in and blended the pupils, they kind of ran up and down. I just kind of fell in love with it because it was a different way to see my own face. With self-portrait number 27, that's probably the most intense self-portrait I've done in terms of staring at it and having a personal relationship with it while I was making it. My shoulders were kind of hunched, and I didn't really like my face, which I often don't like my face in these photographs, which is a lot of the intent behind masking it or pushing it back in some way, so I don't really have to engage with it on a real level, or I don't have to think of it as me constantly. I had this idea of sanding down to just this darkness, but I'd never done it before. During the process of going and sanding down and seeing that darkness and that charred effect come through was really kind of startling and terrifying, and I wasn't sure if I liked it. It was one of the first portraits where I included my whole body, including my breasts. It was also just this relationship to how I felt about my body and painting it in such a raw way and just being so exposed. Questioning whether I was really up for that or if I wanted to be exposed in that way. But then I always go back to the paintings that I find the most powerful and inspiring, and it's the ones where people made themselves the most vulnerable. So I kind of just sucked it up and saw this crazy part of myself and just tried to be okay with it. Okay, so with the painting Me When I'm With You, everyone who's been to a therapist knows it becomes this really intense, dynamic relationship you have with this person where there's supposed to be this distance, yet you're telling them your deepest, darkest secrets. So it's this very interesting relationship. And I'd had this dream where I was in a class being critiqued, and I held up this painting. I was telling everyone, this is a painting of how I think of myself when I'm with Anne, who's my therapist. And it was a lot different than the painting actually made. It was more yellow, and it had these kind of crazy blue circles around the eyes. So I didn't want to replicate it exactly, but I thought it was an important idea for me to think about the space and the self that I inhabit when I'm with this specific person, because it feels so much different than when I'm with anyone else. With all this time, I knew it was going to be a little challenging just based on the size, and it's kind of another one that relates to just this past year of doing a lot of work on myself and digging deep into old childhood stuff and old memories and trying to figure stuff out that's going on now based on that foundation, which I relate a lot to the paintings kind of going down to this foundation level. So this was the first portrait where I started doing the line work. It's important in terms of technique only because it relates to the story behind it. So again, I was thinking a lot about just going through these therapeutic sessions and reworking all this stuff and how it feels like this base level that's incomprehensible thinking about consciously. Lines kind of came up from the bottom, coming up from the thighs up, and as they pass the hands, which are kind of this white element symbolizing what we can actually do and change and accept, they come up through the bottom, and then again they're on the top surface in color. So it's kind of just this line work, almost like a timeline, like flowing up to the surface. I Am But One Small Instrument is a portrait of my friend Calvin. It was interesting because in the world of today and technology, I met him first as kind of this online personality on MySpace. Just like found him incredibly fascinating. I ended up moving to New York. So it was this space where I could actually meet him and become friends with him, and then finding that his real life persona is much different than his online persona. His tattoo was kind of the part that I wanted to really focus on, and I usually think of tattoos as kind of cheesy or something to really approach in a painting, but I knew if I did it in a way that was kind of like graphic and simple that I could really emphasize the idea behind it. And I think that he thinks of it in terms of God, and he was raised Mormon, so I know that there's kind of some troubling religious issues that go on with him. I've met people and they've mentioned wanting to pose for me, and then usually when someone says they want me to paint them, it automatically kind of like turns me off to the idea, because it has to just be this like really organic thing. So I knew that he really wanted me to paint him, but there was something about that relationship where him asking made sense. So I think he was just kind of in awe of it at first, and then was really like shy around it. I think it fulfilled some kind of thing in his life. Powerfully is the person who posed for it is an artist at my gallery in New York, and his name's Chino, and when I met him, I just felt this automatic kind of innate connection to him on this strange like spiritual level. So that moment I knew that I needed to paint him and kind of like figure out what that is. Usually I have like really intense conversations with people while the session's going on, but he was still pretty quiet and reserved, and I was asking him to kind of move his hands, and he mentioned like the idea of like Renaissance and like those kind of like finger poses. That was when he felt most comfortable, so that's kind of how I related the image. Almost not as like an actual physical person, but more as like this idea of like this spiritual being. Solving Contract is a painting of my high school sweetheart's mother, and her name's Hiroko, and she's Japanese and she was raised in Japan, so she still has that cultural context around her. The relationship to her son, who I dated, was really intense in terms of expectations. So just kind of the expectations around it and how that parental relationship can crumble or dissolve according to what the child decides to do with their life. So the painting Let Go is probably one of the heaviest I've done to date. It's a portrait of my friend David Raymore, who I did all of the collaboration pieces with. We went through grad school together, and I just developed this immense crush and just love affair with this gay male that I'd never experienced before. We ended up having studios next to each other during school and always sharing ideas, and he was a big force behind a lot of the evolving I did. There came a point after we did the collaboration show where that connection was a little too stressed. Like we were just too involved with each other to the point where it just came down to our work, and I think it just got too intense and a little too deep. We just had this conversation that I don't think I've even talked to him about it, but it felt like a breakup conversation. So the painting is of him and letting go of him, like in a very like metaphorical, literal sense, and whiting his face out and just saying, I release you, not from my life, but just energetically, so I don't have to hold on to this anymore. Don't Leave Me Mother was done during grad school, and I had built up the courage to ask my parents to pose for me over Christmas, and so I've always had this like secret desire to paint these paintings for myself and never show anyone. And I'll always have the same exact photographs because they'll never let me photograph them again. So it'll be this same image just over and over in time, which I'm kind of interested in exploring. And I've even thought about how dark those paintings are and how it relates such a weighted emotion, and if maybe I can approach it in a lighter, even healthier way, that it could even transform something on another level for me with them.